All right, well, thank you everyone for joining me today, and thank you On One Software for having me do another webinar with you. My name is Matt Suess. I'm a full-time fine art photographer based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Scottsdale, Arizona. And I've been a professional photographer for 24 years, and since 2006, I've been selling my artwork full-time on the art show circuit out here in the Southwest. And going through the shows, I travel about 6 or 7 different states every year, and I get the opportunity to meet a lot of great photographers that are also selling their own work. And I also get to see a lot of photography. And there's a lot of we're going to be talking today about how to optimize your photos for print. And there's a number of problems that I see out there in the field in regards to print quality. Now, print quality is really important when you're selling your work. It's, it's what people are purchasing, what they're going to be hanging on their wall, and it's your job to really give them the best possible photo. And I've noticed some common problems that we can easily correct when we're optimizing our photos before we send them to the printer. Now, some of those problems that you see are lost details in the highlights, muddy shadows, or shadows open too much. I see a bunch of flat images that just don't have any contrast or punch. Some problems with chromatic aberrations, and you see some color fringings around light to dark areas in the photos. And believe it or not, I still do see some dust spots in the photos. Dust spots are really easy to remove, but sometimes they're kind of difficult to see on your screen, but you always see them in the print. I've also seen halos around dark edges, oversaturation. Oversaturation is kind of that's kind of a personal opinion on that. I know a lot of photographers that like to have more muted colors. Me personally, I see the world very colorfully, so I really have a lot of punch to my photos, and I push the limit on saturation, but there are limits, and it's easy to go over. There's also, I've seen some problems with over and under sharpening, usually more on the over sharpening. And I've also seen problems with photos being enlarged way too much. So we're going to go through and tackle a lot of these problems here, and I'm going to show you what to look out for and how to correct them. And what we're going to do first is we're going to talk about lost details in the highlights and the muddy shadows. I'm going to open up Lightroom here, and we're going to take a look at a photo I just photographed last week up in Yellowstone. And I already did some minor corrections here on it in the raw software. We can take a look and see what the before and after was. The first step in dealing with blown out highlights is to not have them in the first place. I recommend that everyone shoot in the raw format, and always pay attention to your histogram. Make sure that your histogram is not blowing out the highlights. It's far easier to recover shadows than it is highlights. So when we're looking at this photo here, let me get this back. So I've enhanced this and I've got my histogram pretty good, but I notice the clouds are still bright up there. In Lightroom, we can use the highlight slider and knock that down to bring back and recover our highlights. So let me zoom in here a little bit, and let me bring up the original here too. Now again, I exposed for my highlights, so this original was probably underexposed by maybe just about 1/3 of a stop, but it enabled me to get all that detail in the brightest whites of the cloud. So you want to use your highlights. If I zero that back out, you want to bring that down to bring back as much detail as you can in the clouds. Now, I'm showing you here this in Lightroom. I use Capture One Pro for my work, and I found that in Capture One Pro, the highlight slider is a lot more sensitive, and you can bring back even more detail in the highlights. So I can max this all the way out here, and we can see how much more detail I have in there. And I just have to do some more corrections to the overall brightness of the image to bring it back to life a little bit. And let's go back to Lightroom again here. I'm going to show you another photo here too. Same principle. This was the before and the after. And bring that back, and we'll zoom in. I can notice up here, this is where my problem area is, so I want to darken down those highlights. Now another problem here that we can see when we're zoomed in is a little bit of fringing right over here, a little purple fringing. That's the chromatic aberrations. You're going to find that in areas where you have a real bright source going to a dark area. A lot of times you'll find it in the edges and the corners of your photos. In Lightroom, scroll down under the lens correction. They have a little checkbox there. that you can click, and you can remove those chromatic aberrations right there. Same thing, I'll switch back over to Capture One Pro, and we have that over in here, and we can zoom in. Let me get to that same photo. Zoom in on that area there, and zoom in a little bit more so you can see this is what you're really looking for. And you'll see fringes of red, sometimes fringes of purple, and even green. I can see a little bit up in the corners up in here. Click on that chromatic aberration, and that knocks that out. Now, what happens if you've, let's say you forgot to do that in your image? You're already processing it and doing some cool effects in the Perfect Photo Suite, and you notice that you still have some more chromatic aberrations. You can try importing that file back into Lightroom or Capture One Pro, and using that same technique. I'm going to show you a way in Photoshop. I'm sure many of you have Photoshop and are using Perfect Photo Suite as a plugin. I'm going to show you a way to manually get rid of that in Photoshop. So I'm going to zoom in here, and we'll get back to that cloud. Okay, so you want to zoom in so that you're seeing it, just the areas that you want to deal with, and you're going to want to use the stamp tool. Now, under the stamp tool, you have mode options, and you want to change that from normal and bring that down to color. Okay, now adjust your brush size. I use the bracket keys to adjust my brush size real easy. And what you want to do is sample from the cloud, and then just start painting in. And actually, I'm going to turn off that little mouse thing so we can see what we're looking at here. So painting just in over the over that purple area. Now you can see that it's turning another color there. What I'm going to do now is sample from the blue from the other side, and then catch that other edge there. Now this is obviously, as you can see, it can become a real time-consuming problem, or a time-consuming way to fix this. So it's always good to, when you're starting with your raw software, to make sure you have that adjustment all set and finished in there. But again, if you forget, this is one way that you can do that, and you can go through your entire image and clean up those chromatic aberrations. Okay, let me, oh, okay. Okay, so we're going to go into another photo here, and this photo here I processed in Perfect Photo Suite and was using Perfect Black and White and also Perfect Effects to really push this image and really get some cool effects on that. But if we zoom in, you can notice that I have a little bit of a halo going around here. Now this halo, when we zoom out, it's not as noticeable, but trust me, when you print this, you definitely see it. So we're going to use, seeing that I'm still in Photoshop, we're going to use the stamp tool in here, and instead of in the color, we're going to go back to normal. Now, Perfect Photo Suite also has a stamp tool too. You can do the same thing. Because I was in Photoshop, I'm just going to stay here. And what I'm going to do is zoom in, and I have a, one thing that makes this process easy is that I have a Wacom tablet, and it's pressure sensitive. And Perfect Photo Suite is great too because it uses the pressure sensitivity of the Wacom, and it really helps when you're doing things like this. So I'm just going to click from the outside and then just start painting in over this white halo. And all I'm doing is sampling really just from right above that, from that area. And again, just like I was doing with the chromatic aberrations, you're going to want to do this all throughout. It is a time-consuming process again, but it's it's a way to get rid of these annoying halos, and when you see them in print, they're pretty annoying. I don't like them at all. So that's going to definitely improve the quality of your print, and we can just see here just a before and an after real quick on doing this. A lot of times when I'm doing these types of corrections, I like to make a new duplicate layer, and you can do that in Photoshop just using the Command J button. And then that way there, when you're doing your corrections, you can just turn on and off the layer real fast to see how that's going. Okay, I'm going to quit out of Photoshop now. And we're going to go into Perfect Photo Suite. And we're going to work on a photo here. Now this photo I had already done some pre-adjustments on in Capture One Pro. And I'm just going to set my adjustments here. I'm going to be editing a copy of this photo, and I'm going to keep it in the color space Adobe RGB 1998. If you're going to be sending your prints to a lab, most labs prefer srgb. And I'll show you how we'll do that at the very end when we're going to be using perfect resize. But throughout your entire process, I'd recommend staying with the Adobe RGB 1998 profile. It has a much larger color gamut. Okay, so let's bring this into effects. And again, this is from Capture One Pro, and my goal, if you saw my webinar last month where I showed you my workflow from Capture One Pro through Perfect Photo Suite, my goal in the raw software is to get the image looking pretty decent, where I can then use Perfect Photo Suite to then take over and really do the fine tuning and touches on it. One of my favorite tools is the dynamic contrast. And we're just going to click on here and open up the thumbnails to see the different presets that they have available. A lot of times I'll just start with one of them. It doesn't matter which one, because I go through down on the right hand side and do my manual adjustments over here. Now, I like to use dynamic contrast to really bring out the fine detail in my photo, and I also use it as a sharpening tool too. I don't use any of the sharpening filters. The only times I really sort of sharpen my photos is when I'm using dynamic contrast, and then at the end in perfect resize. So I like to zoom in at about 50% so I can see some good detail in my photos. And now the adjustments here that you have here, the large, this is going to do increments in large, huge blocks. And then you have the medium, this is for sort of your medium detailed parts of the image, and small. I like to use the sliders and max them out just to see what it's going to be affecting and how much, and then back off of them. Now, I was talking about over sharpening as one issue, and we can see here, I'll just take the small slider and max that out. If you noticed, it almost started giving like some white halos and fringing around here. The sharpening is something that you're going to have to get used to seeing. This is definitely way too much. So I like to start off and see how far it goes, and then back it off, and then just start adjusting, making my adjustments to the detail just before I start seeing a lot of that white fringing. And it's dependent on your photo. It's a shot of the Tetons, and so I want to give this just a little bit of a boost here. Now, when I'm doing these adjustments, and we were talking about protecting highlights, all the effects in Perfect Photo Suite, they have a section here where you can protect your highlights and your shadows and your skin. And this is where, whenever you're doing these effects, you want to pay attention to your brightest parts of the image to make sure you're not losing your highlights. If I click on the before and the after, I'm just starting to lose a little bit of detail in my brightest whites, and I still want to keep some detail in there. So I'll move this protect slider over, and we can see that brought that right back. Another thing that you can do is, if you find that the protect slider is not doing enough, we can just go up here and use the masking brush, and then size it down, and then we can paint out in our brightest areas the where we're losing some of the highlights. So that's something that you want to pay attention to when you're working on your effects, is any of your bright spots in your photos. You just keep on paying attention to that, because these sliders down below are going to affect your whole image, and then this is where we can scale it back and protect some of those areas. Okay, I'm going to zoom back out here, and we'll just take a quick look at the before and after right there. Before it looked nice, but then with that dynamic contrast, we got a lot more detail in here and a little bit more contrast and pop. What I want to do here is let's add another layer and go into the adjustable gradient. And this is the darken adjustable gradient is one of my favorites when working on landscapes, and in particular when I have sky, and in this case a blue sky up above. And I'm just going to throw that adjustable gradient on and make an adjustment here. By adjusting this this dotted line out there, that's going to adjust the transition and how soft from the dark to nothing is going to it's going to adjust that transition. If we look over here on the right-hand side, we can see the black mask down below, and because I opened that up, we can see how it's a little bit gray over there. If we look over here, I'll give you a better view of that. If we slide this down, that's going to be given more of a solid line. That would probably be more beneficial if you were photographing, you had a landscape at the ocean. With this here, I want to blend that darkness up into the mountains and turn my preview back on and get this to after. And we'll just take a quick look there. There we go. Okay, so that darkened down my sky, gave me a nice balance in the photo, and probably just go one more layer here, and we'll go into this one. I'm going to do manually and go into color enhancer. And what I'd like to do is just give it just a little bit more pop. Now this did some auto correction to it, and it seemed to take away a little bit of the warmth from it. I kind of like that warmth. And let's just increase the saturation just a little bit, and maybe the brightness just a touch. And again, a lot of times I normally just automatically click on the highlight protector just to knock that down without even zooming in. But we'll take a look inside here and just make sure that that peak, I still had detail up in there. Still got the detail. Perfect. Okay, with these adjustments here, we'll take a look. And what I've been able to do here is correct what was sort of a flat image. Wasn't too bad, but I was able to correct a little bit of that flatness, add a little bit more punch to it, and in particular really sharpen that up. And this right now, this photo is going to be ready to save and then go into perfect resize. I'm going to go through one more photo here, and then we'll go all the way into perfect resize. Get back to my browse module, and let's take a look at this one here. And I'm going to edit a copy again, make sure all my settings are correct. Okay, same thing. I'm going to go into dynamic contrast, and we'll start off with the natural. And I think this is going to be a little bit more dramatic here in terms of and you can see when I'm making my adjustments, I'm looking at 50%, and I'm looking to get a good overall view of. So when I'm making these adjustments, this is going to give me a good visual overall as to what is happening here without having to keep on panning around in the image. Okay, so I'm going to make just a little bit adjustments here. I want to really make that mountain pop in the background. Okay, again, if I went too far, we can see how it just starts looking too sharp and too blocky, and that's not going to translate well into print. Okay, good, got that. Then we'll go into darken that sky just a little bit again, so we'll go into the adjustable gradient and go into darken and move my masking bug up. And just like before, I'm going to open that up a little bit. And let's take a look at that before and after. Just that little slight adjustment makes a world of difference up there and brings that back into balance with the entire photo. Okay, I'm going to hit a new layer, and we will go into tone enhancer because I want to scroll down here, turn off the auto. And what I want to do is just bring up my shadows a little bit. Now this is where you can get a little too crazy. And if I bring this up all the way to the right, we can see that the photo's getting flat again. Me personally, I like to have some contrast and darkness in my shadows, and I don't mind if I have some black points in there, especially down in the base of these trees. You know, where the branches meet the base of the tree. That's fine if that goes almost completely black. So I'm just going to bring my shadows up a little bit and maybe just give a little bit more brightness to this. Okay, good. And we'll add a new layer, another one here, and let me remember where it is. Nope, it's under the color, or my color enhancer. Okay. And scroll down to the green enhancer. this preset is perfect for adding just a little bit of punch to your greens. And we'll wait for this to, hopefully this doesn't crash here on me. Normally when I do webinars I have my file size down, but this one here I left as a large image. This is a 6,000 pixel image so that we can see detail when we get into resize. Okay, good, so that was fine. I'm going to just back this off a little bit. And let's take a look at the before and after just on that green enhancer. Wait for that to catch up again. Oh, turn it back on. Come on. There we go. Okay, so that gives a little bit more life to the foliage in my foreground here. And I am almost done with this image. I'm going to do one more thing here, and I'm going to go into the color enhancer. And there we go. Okay, I'm going to turn off the auto again. And what I want to do is, now here on the saturation, I want to give this a little bit more punch. But if we see we turn this up, I'm going to exaggerate this a bit here. But I have seen actually photos that are this punchy. For me, this is kind of overkill on the saturation slider. So we want to back this off. And what I'm really trying to do is just bring some more life in back here and down in here. And I notice as I'm doing that, I'm getting a lot more blue saturation in the mountain. But that is going to be fine because we're going to correct that in just a moment here. So I'm going to get my overall global saturation to where I'm happy with. Then on the color range, I'm going to switch down to the blue. And just to make sure that I'm going to be attacking the right colors, I'm going to max this out. And I notice that exactly this is all in the mountain area there that I want to get rid of. So I'm going to knock the saturation down on that. Now the expense was, let me get this back to 0, I was losing some of my we're just going to back this down to where the color is that I want it for the mountain. And then we're going to go up here in the upper left hand corner and we're going to use the masking brush. I'm going to select the masking brush and then click on invert. And I'm just going to give you a little warning there. And then what I'm going to do is this is going to enable me now to paint in the area here. And we can see that scrolling up here in my layer mask right over there. And let's knock that saturation down a little bit more. And I'm going to put the perfect brush on so I make sure that I'm just working in the areas that I want to work in here. So this enabled me to increase the overall saturation, but then go back in and knock down some of that where it was becoming a little bit too intense. And let's just take a look at the before and the after. And we can see a little bit of a difference, especially right in here. And just click back on. Come on, there we go. Oh. And just let that wait for 1 second. Went right back off on me. There we go. All right, on this one, I'm going to hit save and close. And while that's processing, I'm just going to close a couple things off in the background here, free up some resources. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to go into perfect resize. And I absolutely love perfect resize. Back before perfect resize existed, I was enlarging my photos the old manual way in Photoshop. There was a technique to really get the best out of your images to increase the size every 10%. Instead of just going from like a 20-inch image to a 40-inch image, you'd increase the size 10% each time in each step to get the perfect enlargement. Otherwise, if you went too far in your enlargements, you'd start getting some blockiness and some undesirable effects. Perfect resize is awesome for enlarging and also shrinking your photos. Okay, so here I'm going to resize this, and I know that, let's say I'm going to print this myself. I'm going to leave this at Adobe RGB 98, and the Epson and Canon printers, they can handle that color space. If you were going to be resizing for a print lab, check with your print lab. Most of them are going to want it in srgb. So you're going to want to do the conversion yourself. You don't want to let them do that. So switch it over to srgb here. I'm going to leave this in Adobe RGB, and we'll go over to perfect resize. Now, in perfect resize, there are a number of, on the left-hand side here that I don't have open, there's a number of presets that you can use. We're not going to go through those right now. We're going to go and do this manually. Now, if we look at this image was brought in as a 6,000 pixel wide image. And if this were to print out at 300 dpi, which is what the, if you're sending this out to a lab, they're going to want it in 300 dpi. This will print out at 20 inches by 13 and 13 and a third. Let's see what happens when we double, or let's bring this up to 30 inches. So select this over here, and I'm going to type in 30 and tab out of there. And what I want to do here is have this at 50% again. Let me bring this back down to 20. We'll reset that. Okay, the reason why I like to be at 50% is that this closely gives me the right size of how this is going to look in print, sort of a one-to-one. If I'm looking at this, this will print 20 inches wide, and I'm looking at it on my monitor at roughly about a one-to-one scale here, and that's where I like to stay in that 50% when I'm evaluating the quality of the image. So if we increase this to 30, we're going to see this zoom in just a little bit. Now, when you're enlarging your photos, in perfect resize, you could resize this literally as large as you want to. If you're going to do a billboard, you know, a photo for a billboard, you can use perfect resize to size it up that large. The quality is becomes sort of subjective in a sense that when you're doing your enlargements, what I look for is sizing it up to a size where just before the image starts falling apart. Now, it also depends on your viewing distance. Now, again, if you're going to be resizing for a billboard, you're going to be looking at that from quite a distance away, so you're not going to see a lot of the tiny little imperfections that happen when enlarging it that much. If you can imagine looking at an 8x12 photo on a wall, you're going to be looking at that pretty closely, as opposed to like a 30x45 where you step back maybe 5 or 6 feet so that your eyes are seeing the entire image all at once without having to move your head. And I try and base the quality based on the intended viewing distance. So a 30x45 is going to be intended to be viewed from a lot larger of a distance away than an 8x12. So let's bring this up to 60 inches and see what happens on the quality here. Okay. I think right now at 60 inches, for me personally, this is probably about the limit of this. And what I'm looking at here is I'm looking at this mountain edge right over here. I'm noticing that I'm just starting to lose some detail in the mountain, and almost the trees are just starting to look a little blocky. I would say that this would probably be the maximum for me, that I would enlarge this image. But we're also going from a 20-inch image to a 60-inch image, so we're tripling the size. So that's pretty darn good. Okay, so once we figure out what size we're going to want to enlarge this to, there's some things that we can do to improve the quality right off the bat here. Underneath the settings, we have some default settings here for low-res JPEG, portrait, landscape, high detail, custom. The differences between these are very subtle. I usually just keep it on landscape. And to be honest, I don't do any of these adjustments here. If I were to just max all of these out, just to see what the difference would be, for my eyes, I hardly see a difference here. So I'm going to hit the reset on that, and we'll ignore that. And I'm not even seeing any difference. So outside of leaving this on landscape and the method of genuine fractals for doing the enlargement, I don't mess around with any of those other settings. But let's take a look now at the sharpening setting. Okay, this is very important, and you have 3 ways of sharpening. I prefer the progressive sharpening, and it's kind of like the smart sharpen in Photoshop. Now let's go and max this out. Now, I've seen photos printed like this, and it's just way over sharpened. You can notice that you start getting halos around your dark and light edges. This is where, again, like I was talking about with the dynamic contrast, I try and get a balance just before I start seeing a lot of white starting to appear. And on this image here, it's looking like probably in the low 30s here. Works out pretty good. And I like to then scan around my image just to make sure that I'm not having any issues elsewhere. And we'll just wait for the screen to redraw here. Again, like I said, normally we're using smaller images on the webinars, but can't use a small image to really show off the powers of perfect resize. There we go. And let's just take a look. I'll show you how that sharpening affects the trees down here. So we'll enlarge that. And see, it just becomes white. You're actually losing detail by trying to gain detail. So we'll back that off and into the upper 30s. Now here's another important step here too. Here's that protect highlights again. This will help you reduce some of the halos that you can get when you're doing your sharpening. And let's get up to the mountain here where we can see a little bit clearer, and we'll wait for that screen to refresh again. And it will eventually. Maybe I'm lying, maybe it won't. And this was, let's get that out. There we go. Perfect. Okay, good. Now, if I had this zeroed out, I'm starting to say I can see a little bit of white fringing coming around the mountaintop here, and that's even more pronounced if I increase the sharpening. So I'm going to increase the sharpening just a little bit for this demonstration here. Here's that white halo again that we were talking about earlier in the webinar. This is where the protect highlights can come in very handy. And we increase that protect highlights, and what this is doing is it's not applying any sharpening to your highlighted areas. So if I move this, I increased my sharpening. Let me bring that back down to where I wanted to go with it before. And then a combination of the sharpening amount and the protect highlights should be able to eliminate any haloing that you see. If you find that the image is sharpened, but you still do have that little bit of a halo, you might then have to go in and use the stamp tool and clone out that halo like I explained earlier. Lastly, the film grain. Film grain I use when I have an image that's really noisy. This image was photographed with the Sony A7R, which at 100 ISO, and there's like hardly any noise at all in this image, even by tripling the size of the image. So this really, I can see just a little bit of noise in there, but it's not objectionable to me. If it was, I would turn on the film grain, and in this case I would lower the amount a little bit. What this is doing is trying to replicate basically film grain back in the old days when we used to shoot film. And for me personally, I find film grain a lot more easy on the eyes than digital noise. So if you're having an issue with noise in there, this is where you can sort of hide it. Okay, so now with the adjustments that I've made, this image is now all set. This will print a 40 by 60, and remember this original was 13 inches by 20, and now I can print a 40 by 60 of this image and still have it be of impeccable quality and detail. I'm going to show you one other thing here. I'm going to cancel out that. I'm not going to save that because that'll take a while to process. And I'm going to show you this panoramic here, and we'll do the same thing. Bring that into perfect resize. And let me scroll down here on a couple other really cool features of perfect resize. The tiling. I used to do my own printing, and I don't anymore, but I still do a lot of triptychs, and this tiling feature is so awesome. Turn on the tiling feature, and it's going to default to, in my case here, an 8 by 10 inches. The tiling, you want to use the tiling if you want to break down your image. Let's say you have a printer that only prints up to 16 or 17 inches wide, but you want to print a 40-inch image. You can use this tiling feature to then print out sections and then put it together, mount them on a substrate and put them together for a big solid panoramic. Easy way to do a triptych in here is to change, instead of inches, go down to columns. columns. And we're going to do a triptych, so we're going to have 3 panels wide, and we just want to change this height to 1. And this automatically sizes each one of these panels the same exact size, does it automatically for you, and then what you'd want to do here is choose your output. You want to do it either as a JPEG or a TIFF. If you're going to be uploading it via the internet to a lab, you most likely want to have it as a JPEG. And then you just choose your location where you want to save those images, and when you hit save and close, what Perfect Resize is going to do is it's going to give you 3 separate files, and it's going to be of each one of these 3 sections, and then you can then print each one of those. If you're going to be doing gallery wraps, let me turn the tiling off here right now. If you're going to print this as a solid panoramic, turn on the gallery wraps. I used to do a lot of my own printing in Canvas, and boy, I wish I had known about this back then, because this makes things so much easier. Turn that on, and what you can do here is, what this did was it did the outline of my main photo, and then it's adding, this is defaulted at 2 inches, so let's say you're going to be using 2-inch stretcher bars. This is doing a reflection of the image here, so that when you do your canvas wrap and you wrap the canvas around the sides, this will reflect the image from the front. You have a couple different options here. You can do a reflect soft, a stretch, which kind of like then just stretches the end out. Not too crazy about the stretch, but what I used to do when I was printing, and instead of doing the reflect, I like to print with a black border. For me, for me personally, I think the image should be looked on straight on and not around the sides and the edges. So what you can do here is just change your opacity and crank this all the way up to 100, and with your opacity color at black, now all of a sudden when you print this image, it's going to print it, your panoramic, and now you're going to have 2 inches of border on the side, and it's going to be black, so that when you do your wrap, you'll have black edges instead of a mirrored effect. Now, what if you wanted to do a triptych with black edges? Well, let's turn the tiling back on. Now, this is going to give you a warning here. Perfect Resize will not preview gallery wraps when turning on the tile. So we're not going to see the effect of it, but it is still going to be there. So now, when we print this, we have a 3-column wide by 1 triptych, and this is going to do it because we have the gallery wrap turned on. This is going to do a black edge for us. If we didn't want to have the black edge, we turn the opacity down, and now it's going to do one of the reflect mirrored edges, or we could switch it to stretch. And this one here I wasn't resizing, so this one would print 13 by 23, but if I did want to enlarge it, the same principles would apply like I just went through on the previous photo. Now, not only is Perfect Resize good for doing enlargements, but I also use it when I want to post online on the web. So what I'll do here is I'll just drop the resolution down to 72, and up in the width here, instead of 1680, I'm going to put 1200 pixels. A lot of times when I'm posting things online, I post them at 1200 pixels. Now here online, this is when I want to look at it when it's 100%, not the 50%. And again, we can go through the sharpening area here, and this is where, just a little bit, when you have a small image, a little bit of adjustment on the sharpening does a huge amount. So this is where you really, my setting here is 9, where before when I was doing an enlargement, it was up in the upper 30s. And again, it's dependent on your specific image. Some images that have a lot of detail, you may need to sharpen a little bit more than images that don't have a lot of detail to it. And again, the sharpening with sharpening, it also depends on what you're going to be printing. Now, if you're going to be printing on a watercolor paper or a canvas paper, those papers have a bump in them, and they have ridges in them, and that kind of takes away some of the sharpening from your photo, as if you were printing on on aluminum or on a metallic photo print like I do. When you're printing on aluminum or metallic photo paper, you see every single mistake in there. And in particular, what I was talking about earlier with the dust spots, you want to make sure that you're zoomed in at 100% and looking at your image, and I'll go through that in layers to make sure you don't have any dust spots. But again, back to what I was saying with the loosening the sharpening, you might find that you need to use a little bit more sharpening when you're printing on a canvas or a watercolor paper as opposed to one of the glossy papers. And that you can find out by a little bit of trial and error, and sending a print to the lab or printing it yourself and seeing how that works. The last thing I just wanted to talk about was the dust spots. If we go into layers, I'm going to just use the same image here. I'm not sure if I had any in here, but let's go into 100%. A lot of times when I'm looking for dust spots, I like to move the image around a little bit, and that's when you can start seeing those dust spots. And this image, I think, was one of the, might have corrected. No, actually, by moving around just a little bit, I can see one that I missed, and it was right up on top of the mountain. Which mountain? There we go. You might not be able to see it on the web, but I can see ever so slightly one right over there. And what I'll use in here is the retouch brush and increase the size of it to cover that dust spot and get rid of it. I do this moving around a lot, and I found that it's increased my my ability to spot some of those real hard to see dust spots. And again, here's one up on top here too. Right up on the top, this was one that I'd missed earlier. And by moving this around and moving it back and forth, you can a little bit easier see some of those that are difficult to see on the screen, but you will see it in print.